Ellen Hawkins arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and she did not stop talking from the moment the stagecoach wheels quit rolling to the moment the driver begged her, with considerable desperation in his eyes, to please step down so he could water his horses. She had been talking since Missouri, through the long rolling plains of eastern Kansas, past the dry creek beds and the scattered homesteads that grew farther and farther apart the more west they traveled, until the land opened up into something vast and humbling, and a little frightening if you let yourself think about it too long. Ellen had not let herself think about it too long. She had talked instead. She talked about her mother's recipe for apple preserves, and whether cinnamon was truly necessary or merely fashionable. She talked about the novel she had read on the train from Cincinnati, and whether the heroine had made the right choice in the third chapter. She talked about the injustice of women not being permitted to vote, which caused the traveling merchant beside her to shift uncomfortably in his seat, and about the particular cruelty of corset stays on long journeys, which caused him to look deliberately out the window for the remaining 40 miles. None of it mattered to anyone on that stagecoach. But Ellen talked because silence, for her, was not restful. Silence was the kind of space where grief crept in sideways and took up residence without asking, and she had been carrying enough grief already from Cincinnati, without giving it any more room than it needed. She was 26 years old, freshly widowed after 2 years of marriage to a man named Gerald Hawkins who had been kind but dull, and who had left her with a small inheritance, a mortgage she could not pay on a city house she did not want, and the persistent and well-meaning advice of every woman in her social circle that she was far too chatty, too opinionated, too loud in her enthusiasms for a woman of her circumstances to attract a second husband in a respectable city. Her friend Clara had suggested Kansas. Clara had a cousin in Caldwell who wrote letters about the booming cattle trade, about the Kishom Trail that ended right there at the edge of the territory, about how the town was growing faster than anyone could build it, and how there was real opportunity for a woman willing to work. Clara's cousin needed help running a boarding house. The pay was modest, but the room was included, and the air, she had written, was extraordinary. Ellen had packed her 2 trunks, sold what she could, settled what debts she could settle, and climbed aboard the first train heading west. Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was exactly what the letters had promised, and nothing like what Ellen had imagined. It was dust and noise and wood-frame buildings, so knew you could still smell the pine sap in the afternoon heat. It was cowboys coming up the trail from Texas, their horses lean and road-worn, their faces so sunburned they looked like they had been carved from red clay. It was saloons and a dry goods store and a post office and a livery stable, and on the eastern edge of town, a 2-story boarding house with a hand-painted sign that read Mercer's rooms and board, clean beds, reasonable rates. Clara's cousin was a woman named Dora Mercer, 42 years old, wide-shouldered and efficient, with the kind of face that had once been beautiful and had settled into something better which was formidable. She met Ellen at the stagecoach stop with a handshake that could have bent iron. "You're the talker," Dora said. It was not a question. "I have been described that way," Ellen admitted. "Well," Dora said, picking up one of Ellen's trunks as though it weighed nothing, "I run a boarding house. I hear everything eventually. You'll fit right in or you won't, and we'll know inside a week." Ellen liked her immediately. The boarding house had 6 rooms, 4 of which were currently occupied by cattle drovers who were between trail drives and spending their wages with admirable dedication at the saloons each night and sleeping like the dead each morning. There was also a schoolteacher named Mr. Finch who was 40 years old and deeply suspicious of everyone, and a woman named Martha Belden who was waiting for her husband to come and collect her from his cattle-buying trip south, and who had been waiting for 3 weeks longer than he had promised. Ellen settled into the remaining room, which was small but had a window that faced east so the morning light came in clean and golden, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted since Gerald's funeral. She was somewhere new. Nobody here knew her history. Nobody here knew Gerald or the mortgage or the 3 miscarriages they had never spoken aloud even to each other, each one a small silence that had accumulated in their marriage like sediment. She could be, if she chose, any version of herself. She chose the version that talked because that was the truest one. Within 3 days, Ellen had learned the names of every regular customer who took meals at Mercer's, the history of the cattle trail season from 2 of the drovers, and the complete and complicated marital situation of Martha Belden, whose husband, it emerged through careful and sympathetic conversation, was not actually on a cattle-buying trip but had most likely stopped in Wichita on his way back and was proceeding to find reasons not to return. Martha had cried. Ellen had made tea. The conversation had lasted 4 hours, and by the end of it, Martha had written a letter to her brother in Topeka asking him to come and bring her home. Dora watched all of this with the same expression a woman uses when she has hired help that is more capable than expected but is still reserving judgment. The problem with Caldwell, or at least the problem with Ellen in Caldwell, was that the town was not Cincinnati. The social rules were different, and the men especially were baffled by her. Cowboys who rode in off the trail were accustomed to a particular kind of woman, either the kind who worked in the saloons and were plainly there for business, or the kind who were wives and kept themselves quietly domestic and did not offer opinions on trail management or water rights, or whether the new mayor was doing an adequate job. Ellen was neither kind. She was a boarding house employee with an opinion about everything and the vocabulary to express it in complete sentences. "Ma'am," one of the drovers said one morning over breakfast, "you sure do have a lot to say for a woman on the frontier." "I have a lot to say in general," Ellen told him pleasantly, and refilled his coffee. 2 weeks into her time in Caldwell, Dora sat her down after supper. "I have had 3 men tell me this week that you talk too much," Dora said. She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way a doctor tells you about a fever, which is to say, as information that has to be dealt with regardless of how you feel about receiving it. Ellen felt the old sting of it. She had heard this her whole life. Her father had said it. Her teachers had noted it. Her mother had tried to cure her of it with increasingly creative incentives, none of which had worked. Gerald had never said it, which had been one of the things she had loved about him, but she had caught him sometimes pressing his lips together in that particular way that meant he was choosing patience over honesty, and that had been its own kind of quiet wound. "I know," Ellen said. "I am not telling you to stop," Dora said. "I am telling you because this is a small town and people talk, and if the men who use this boarding house start going elsewhere for their meals because they find you disconcerting, then I have a business problem. I am not saying it is fair. I am saying it is true." Ellen looked at the table for a long moment. Outside the window the sun was going down in its spectacular Kansas fashion, painting the dust in the street with colors that had no business being so beautiful in a place so rough. "I will try to be more selective," Ellen said. "You do not have to be less," Dora said carefully, and there was something in her voice that sounded like it had cost her something to say that. "Just be thoughtful about when." Ellen nodded. She understood the distinction even if she did not particularly like it. It was 2 weeks after that conversation that Isaac Whitaker came into the boarding house looking for a room. Ellen saw him first through the kitchen window. He came on a gray horse, a good one, well kept despite the miles on it, and he dismounted with the kind of ease that meant he had been on horseback so long that the ground felt like the foreign thing. He was tall in the way of men who have worked outdoors their whole lives, broad through the shoulders but lean everywhere else, with dark hair that had gone too long without cutting and a jaw that had gone 2 days without shaving. He wore a hat that had seen genuine weather and boots that were clean despite everything else about the day being dusty. He did not look like the trail drovers. He moved differently, quieter, with a particular quality of stillness that Ellen noticed before anything else. He stood at the gate of the boarding house and looked at the sign for a moment, and in that moment his face held an expression she could not quite name, something between tiredness and something older, something that had been sitting behind his eyes for a long time. He came inside and Dora was in the back, so Ellen took the counter. "I need a room," he said. His voice was low, not deliberately so, just the voice of a man who had not used it much recently. "For at least a week, maybe longer." "We have one available," Ellen said. $3 a week including 2 meals a day. Breakfast at 7, supper at 6. You miss those, you fend for yourself." He nodded and reached into his coat for his money. "Are you here for the cattle trade?" Ellen asked, because it was the obvious question in Caldwell in the spring. "Ranch business," he said. She waited for more. He did not provide it. She tried again. "Local ranch, or are you coming from down the trail?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she noticed his eyes were a particular shade of gray-brown that changed depending on where the light fell. "South," he said. "Texas." He paid for his room. He took his key. He went upstairs, and that was the entirety of his communication for the rest of that day. Ellen told Dora about him over the washing up that evening. "He barely said 10 words," Ellen said. "I was asking perfectly reasonable questions and he answered them as if words cost him money." Dora smiled, which was not something she did frequently. "Some men are like that out here. The frontier does that to a person. Too much sky and not enough people. You go quiet." "That sounds lonely," Ellen said. "For some it is, for others it suits them." "Which kind is he?" Dora shrugged. "You can probably find out if you are patient about it." Ellen considered patience as a strategy and decided it was at least worth attempting. She learned his name from the register. Isaac Whitaker, from Cowboy, Texas. Age, as she would learn in conversation later, 31 years old. A working cowboy, and more than that, she would discover. A man with his own small ranch operation that he had built from almost nothing over 7 years in the hill country south of San Antonio. He came down to breakfast the next morning and ate in the manner of a man who considered eating a practical necessity rather than a social occasion. The other boarders, 2 of the trail drovers who were still in residence, talked across the table about the season and the market prices and the difficulties of river crossings that spring, and Isaac listened but did not contribute. Ellen brought coffee and biscuits and said good morning, and he said good morning back, and then she said, because she could not entirely help herself, "The coffee this morning is particularly good. Dora has a contact in Wichita who sends proper ground beans rather than the kind that taste like they were roasted in a barn." He looked up at her. "It is good coffee," he agreed. "Do you prefer it black or with something?" "Black." She poured it and he thanked her, and that was that. But the next morning, she noticed him arrive at the table a few minutes earlier. And the morning after that, he chose the chair that faced the kitchen door rather than the window, which she could only interpret as a preference for watching the room rather than the street. She made a point of not forcing conversation. She had heard what Dora said, and she had heard, more painfully, what the drovers had said, and she was genuinely trying. But there was something about Isaac Whitaker that made her curious in a way that was separate from her general curiosity about everything. He was quiet in a way that was not simple. He was not a stupid man or an uninterested man. When the drovers talked about the cattle market, he listened with the specific attention of someone who understood what he was hearing. When Mr. Finch, the schoolteacher, made a comment at supper one evening about the problems with land claims in the territory, Isaac had looked up, and for a brief moment she had seen the flicker of something he was deciding not to say. On the 4th morning she put a plate of biscuits in front of him and said, without really planning it, "You have an opinion about something right now and you are not saying it. I can tell." He stared at her. She held his gaze and did not apologize for observing him. "Mr. Finch," he said slowly, "has some wrong ideas about land claims." "I thought so," she said. "I noticed your face last night." A silence. "Then he has not been here long enough to understand how the cattle companies operate. He is thinking about it like a city lawyer thinks about it." "Are you going to tell him?" Another silence, longer. "It would not change much." "It might," she said. "Or it might not, but you thought of it." She moved away to refill the other cups, and when she came back past his chair, He was eating his biscuit with a slightly different quality to his stillness. Less closed, she thought, though she could not have explained the distinction to anyone who asked. The week passed. He did not leave. He extended his room for a second week, giving no explanation, and Dora took his money and asked no questions because she was not that kind of landlady. Ellen learned things about him in small pieces, the way you learn a landscape by traveling it slowly instead of from a map. He had grown up in Texas, in a ranching family, the second of 3 sons. His father had died when Isaac was 19, and the older brother had taken the family land, and Isaac had gone out on his own with a horse and a bedroll, and the particular stubborn determination of a young man who has nothing to prove to anyone except himself. He had worked other men's cattle for 8 years, saving wages, and then bought his own parcel of land in the hill country and had been building his operation ever since. She learned all of this across the course of several breakfasts and 2 suppers where circumstance seated them near each other. And she learned it not by asking directly but by asking sideways, the way you have to approach a skittish animal, not straight on but at an angle, talking about something else entirely until the creature realizes you are not a threat. She talked about Cincinnati. She talked about the boarding house she had grown up in, her parents running rooms on the edge of the city, how she had learned to read guests the way other children learn to read books. She talked about Gerald without using his name, just about being married and losing someone, and the strange way grief does not arrive all at once but in small ambushes when you least expect it, standing in a dry goods store looking at a bolt of blue calico and suddenly having to leave before you cried. Isaac listened to all of this. He did not offer platitudes. He did not look uncomfortable with the weight of what she was sharing. He just listened, and at the end of one such conversation he said quietly, "I lost someone too, 3 years ago." She waited. "My wife," he said, "fever. We had been married 14 months. Ellen set down her coffee cup. "I am sorry. It is 3 years past. That does not make it less of a thing to have lost." He looked at her with that gray-brown gaze, and something moved in his face, something that had been held in place for a long time, shifting slightly. "No," he said, "it does not." They sat in the morning light in a silence that, for the first time in her life, Ellen did not feel the need to fill. It was Dora who said something about it first, as Dora tended to say things first when they were worth saying. "You are doing something different with Mr. Whitaker," she said one evening. "I'm not doing anything," Ellen said. "You are listening more than you are talking," Dora said, "which for you is significant." "He is easy to listen to," Ellen said. "When he decides to say something, it is generally worth hearing." Dora looked at her for a long moment. "He is also a good-looking man." Ellen felt warmth rise in her face. "That is entirely irrelevant." "Is it?" "Dora." "I am just noting," Dora said serenely and went back to her ledger book. The town of Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was not a romantic setting by any conventional definition. It was loud with cattle drives and busy with the particular commerce that followed men with trail wages in their pockets. The main street was a perpetual exercise in noise and dust. The saloons ran until late and sometimes past late, and the marshal, a taciturn man named Carr, spent his evenings doing the mathematical calculation of how many cowboys he could manage before things required official intervention. But there were moments. There were the early mornings before the town woke properly, when the air was still cool from the night, and the light came gold across the flat horizon, and the only sounds were the doves and the distant movement of cattle in the pens south of town. There were the evenings when the wind came from the south carrying the smell of new grass, and the sky went through its extravagant performance of color, and even the roughest men in Caldwell would sometimes stop and look west without saying anything. Ellen loved those mornings and those evenings. She had always been someone who took beauty seriously, who treated a remarkable sunset or a particularly perfect cup of coffee as events deserving of full attention and spoken appreciation. This was, she was aware, part of what made people call her too much. She pointed things out. She named them. She said aloud what other people felt privately and apparently preferred to keep that way. One evening in her third week in Caldwell, she was sitting on the front step of the boarding house watching the sky do something extraordinary, wide bands of copper and violet, and a particular shade of pink that she had no adequate word for. And she heard the door behind her and felt rather than saw Isaac come and lean against the porch post. She said, because she could not help it and had stopped trying, "That particular pink is a color I would like to carry around in my pocket. I do not know what to call it." There was a pause. "My mother used to call that color godlight," Isaac said. "She said it was what comes through when the sun is showing off." Ellen turned to look at him. It was the most imaginative thing he had said in 3 weeks. He was looking at the sky, not at her, and there was something so open in his face in that unguarded moment that her heart did something complicated and inconvenient. "That is a very good word for it," she said softly. He glanced at her then, just briefly. "She was a talking woman too," he said. My father used to say she had enough words for 3 families. Did it bother him?" "Lord, no," Isaac said, and his voice held something that was almost a smile. He said the day she went quiet was the day he would start worrying. Ellen felt something warm expand in her chest. "She sounds wonderful." She was. A pause. "She died 8 years ago. Pneumonia one bad winter. And your father, heart, year later." She did not fill that silence with anything. She let it settle around them both, those 2 separate catalogues of loss, and after a moment Isaac sat down on the top step, which put him close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him and the particular smell of horse and leather and wood smoke that was so specific to the men of this territory. "My wife," he said, not looking at her. "She was quiet. I used to think that was restful, 2 quiet people together. But after she died, I kept waiting for someone to say something, and there was just the quiet, and it went on, and then it stopped being restful and started being something else." "What did it start being?" Ellen asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. "Empty," he said. She looked at the godlight sky and felt his answer settle into her like something she had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting. "I have been told my whole life," she said slowly, "that I talk too much for this world or that world or whatever world I happen to be inhabiting, that I am too much in general. Too loud, too opinionated, too enthusiastic about things that are apparently meant to be appreciated quietly." "Who told you that?" "Everyone," she said simply. "My father, my teachers, most of the men I have known, Dora even in a kind way." He turned to look at her then full on, and the evening light was doing something to his face that made her want to memorize it. "I have been too quiet for years," he said. "Since Mary died, if I am honest. Before that even, maybe. I always figured that words were for when you had something important to say. But lately, I have started to think I maybe left a lot of things unsaid that should have been said." Ellen met his gaze. In the years since Gerald, she had grown cautious of her own heart, aware of how it led her into enthusiasms that did not always serve her. But there was something in Isaac Whitaker that was not enthusiasm's object, not a thing she was rushing toward, but something she was standing beside, solid and real and unhurried. "What kind of things?" she asked. He looked away again, back at the sky. "That is the question," he said. "I have not quite figured out how to start." She almost said, "I can teach you." She held it back, which was something she was getting better at. Instead she said, "I find that starting with the nearest true thing usually works." He was quiet for a moment. "The nearest true thing," he said, "is that this has been the most I have talked in 3 years, and I am not sure if that is because you make it easy or because I needed it or both." Ellen Hawkins, who had been told her whole life that she talked too much, found herself completely without words, which was, she thought, rather remarkable. The next morning Isaac did not come to breakfast. Ellen told herself it meant nothing. Men missed meals all the time. He had ranch business he was here to conduct, whatever that was, and presumably that business did not organize itself around her breakfast schedule. She served the other boarders and cleared the plates and washed up with Dora, and did not say a word about it, which meant that Dora said nothing either, which meant they had a very efficient and entirely silent morning that felt strange on Ellen's skin like ill-fitting clothes. He came back at midday, which was not a meal hour, and she heard him on the stairs and then heard him come back down again. And when she came out of the kitchen to see about something, he was standing in the front room with his hat in his hands and an expression that she recognized, having felt it herself, as the expression of someone who has just made a decision and is not entirely sure the decision is wise. "I need to tell you what I am doing in Caldwell," he said. "You do not have to," she said. "I know that. I want to." She set down the plate she was carrying and gave him her full attention. He explained, a cattle operation in Careville in the hill country of Texas. He had built it over the better part of a decade, starting with 60 acres and a small herd, and growing it through careful work and careful saving and considerable sacrifice of the kinds of things other men took for granted: socializing, leisure, comfort. He had 300 acres now, and a house he had built himself, and a herd of 140 head and 2 hired men who had worked with him for 4 years. The problem was a man named Calhoun, Douglas Calhoun, who ran the biggest ranching operation in Kerr County and who had decided 2 years ago that Isaac's land, sitting as it did along a creek that ran year-round, was something he wanted. Calhoun had made offers. Isaac had refused them. Calhoun had applied pressure in the ways that powerful men in the cattle country of Texas applied pressure, cutting off his access to shared water agreements, pressuring the buyers who purchased Isaac's cattle, filing paperwork that questioned the validity of Isaac's land deed on grounds that were thin, but that had to be answered. Isaac had come to Caldwell because one of the cattle buyers here, a man named Porter who operated out of Caldwell for the spring market, was someone who had done legitimate business with Isaac for 4 years and who, if he agreed to continue the relationship, could give Isaac enough economic breathing room to handle Calhoun's legal maneuvering without losing ground. "Is that why you have been here 2 weeks?" Ellen asked. "Porter has been hard to nail down," Isaac said. "He is a busy man in the spring." "Have you spoken with him?" "3 times. He is interested but cautious. He does not want to put himself sideways with Calhoun, who is a significant buyer." Ellen considered this. She thought about what she knew about men who avoided direct answers and took meetings without concluding them. She had grown up watching her parents navigate exactly these kinds of people in their boarding house, the ones who wanted the room but kept delaying the payment. "What does Porter actually need from you?" she asked. Isaac frowned slightly. "His price. A guaranteed quantity." "No," Ellen said. "What does he need to feel safe agreeing?" "Because if he is cautious about Calhoun, then the question is not about cattle. It is about who he is more comfortable disappointing. Right now he thinks it is you because you are smaller. What would change that calculus?" Isaac stared at her. She realized she had been speaking with considerable directness, and part of her braced for the response she usually got, which was a blink and a withdrawal and a polite adjustment of the conversation away from her input. What Isaac did was think about what she had said with visible and genuine consideration. "If I brought in another buyer," he said slowly, "someone Porter respects who is also interested in my cattle, then refusing me costs him a relationship with that buyer too." "Exactly," Ellen said. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely new, not the considering her look or the listening to her look, but something more direct and more personal. "Who do you know in this town?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said, "and I talked to everyone. Let me think about it." She thought about it over the rest of that day, and she had her answer by evening. Among the men who came to take meals at Mercer's there was, periodically, a cattle agent named Willis Barrett who was based in Caldwell and represented several Eastern buyers. She had spoken with him twice, once at length about the state of the cattle market and the growing importance of the Kansas markets as the trail drives consolidated, and he had said things that suggested he was actively looking for reliable Texas suppliers who could guarantee consistent quality. She told Isaac about Barrett at supper quietly, while the other men were involved in their own conversation at the other end of the table. Isaac listened to everything she said. He did not interrupt. He did not qualify or redirect. He listened the way very few people in Ellen's experience had ever listened, with the specific quality of someone who understood that the person talking might know something worth knowing. "Could you introduce me?" he asked. "Barrett is coming for supper Thursday," she said. "I will see to it." "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Because Calhoun sounds like the kind of man who wins too many things," she said. "And because you have spent 3 weeks sitting across breakfast from me and you have never once told me I talk too much." Something happened in his face when she said that. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was the territory adjacent to one. "You do not," he said, "talk too much. Everyone seems to think otherwise." "Everyone is wrong," he said, and there was no qualification in it, no softening or hedging. He said it the way a man states a fact he has looked at from multiple angles and found to be true. Ellen felt that sentence land somewhere in her chest and take up permanent residence. Thursday came. Willis Barrett arrived for supper, and Ellen, in the course of serving and clearing, and moving through the room with the natural ease of someone who had grown up in a boarding house, found occasion to mention to Barrett that one of the other guests was a Texas rancher she thought he might find interesting to talk with, and to mention to Isaac that Barrett had been asking questions about hill country operations, which was not entirely accurate but was not entirely false either. And by the time she brought the pie out, both men were deep in a conversation that had the focused quality of two people discovering a mutual interest. She watched from the kitchen doorway and felt the small, clean satisfaction of having arranged something useful. Dora appeared beside her. "You did that deliberately." "I introduced two men who had a reason to talk," Ellen said. "From across the room while serving chicken and dumplings," Dora said. "Deliberately," Ellen smiled. The meeting between Isaac and Barrett led to a second meeting, and then, on Friday evening, to a conversation between Barrett, Isaac, and Porter that happened at the hotel down the street, and that Isaac reported to her afterward with a kind of restrained excitement that she understood was, for him, the equivalent of someone else celebrating openly. Porter agreed, Isaac said. He was standing in the front room of the boarding house, and he had come in still in his coat, and he looked like a man who had just exhaled something he had been holding for a long time. 3-year agreement. Good terms. Ellen felt joy rise in her like water from a well. "Isaac," she said, and then stopped because she had used his first name without thinking and was not sure if that was too far. He looked at her with an expression that said it was not too far at all. "I would not have thought of it the way you did," he said. "Barrett, making Porter's refusal costly. I had been approaching it as a straight negotiation, and it was never going to work that way." "You would have figured it out," she said. "Maybe." Slower, he paused. "You are very smart, Ellen." Her name in his voice was different from how anyone else said it. "I am told that I express it too loudly," she said. "I think," he said, "that anyone who told you that was afraid of it." She looked at him, this quiet man who had arrived in her life with a quiet horse and a quiet manner and a year's worth of unspoken things behind his eyes, and she thought that whatever she was feeling right now was something she would need to be very careful with, because it was very large and she was still, in some ways, very freshly wounded. "What happens now?" she asked. "With your ranch? With Calhoun?" "I go home," he said. "With a legitimate buyer and a documented agreement. Calhoun can still make trouble, but I have more ground to stand on. The legal business with the deed will take time to resolve, but my lawyer in San Antonio says we have a strong position." He paused. "I will need to leave by Monday." Monday was 4 days away. "Will you come back to Caldwell?" she asked, and she heard in her own voice the thing she was trying to keep from her voice, which was, "Please say yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether there is a reason to," he said. "On whether you are still here." Ellen held very still, the way she rarely did, the way she was only now learning to do when holding still was what the moment required. "I expect I will be here for some time," she said carefully. Dora's boarding house is not going anywhere. Then I will be back, he said, by July at the latest, before the summer drive season ends. I will save your room, she said. He smiled then, full and real, and it changed his face entirely, the way the godlight changed the sky, revealing something that had been there all along just waiting for the right angle. He left on Monday morning. He shook Dora's hand and settled his bill and brought his gray horse around from the livery and stood in the morning light on the street in front of the boarding house, and Ellen was there because she had found a reason to be sweeping the porch at exactly that hour. "Stay safe on the trail," she said. "Try not to reorganize the entire town while I am gone," he said, and there was warmth in it, real warmth, the kind that knows a person well enough to tease them. "I make no promises," she said. He touched the brim of his hat. Then he said, quieter so that only she would hear it, "Thank you, Ellen, for talking to me, for making it easy." She watched him ride south out of Caldwell, and she kept watching long after the dust had settled. The weeks that followed had their own shape. Ellen worked. She found that she was good at the boarding house in ways that went beyond pouring coffee and making beds. She was good at making guests feel known, at the particular art of remembering that one man preferred his eggs scrambled, and another took no salt, and another had a brother in St. Louis he was worried about, not because she was performing interest, but because she was genuinely interested, genuinely curious about the interior lives of the people she served. Dora noticed. Dora always noticed. "I want to make you a formal partner," Dora said one evening in late May. "I am getting older, and this business runs better when there are two of us managing it properly. I cannot pay you much yet, but I can give you a percentage of the proceeds and eventually a share of the property if you stay." Ellen looked at her. "Why?" "Because you are good at this," Dora said, "and because I think you are planning to stay regardless, so I might as well make it official." Ellen thought about Cincinnati, about the city house she had sold, about the life she had decided to leave. She thought about the boarding house where she had grown up and the skills her parents had given her without meaning to, the skills of making a place feel like home for people who were far from theirs. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." She wrote a letter to Clara in Cincinnati telling her about Caldwell and about Dora and about the boarding house and about the extraordinary skies and the cattle drives and the whole extraordinary, improbable adventure of being here. She wrote about Isaac too, carefully and without drama, describing him as a guest who had been particularly interesting, which was true if incomplete. Clara wrote back asking for considerably more detail about the interesting guest, because Clara knew Ellen well enough to read between every line. Ellen wrote back and gave her more detail, and it was in the writing of it that she understood what she was feeling more fully than she had allowed herself to understand it in person, because writing required her to find exact words, and exact words required her to be honest about the exact nature of things. She was, she wrote, somewhat at risk of falling in love with a man who had barely said a word to her for the first 2 weeks and then turned out to have more to say than she had expected. A quiet man, a careful man, a man who listened. She sent the letter and then stood at the kitchen window for a long time thinking about being careful. She was still thinking about it when June arrived, hot and bright and noisy with the summer cattle traffic, and the boarding house filled and emptied and filled again with the rhythm of the trail season, and Ellen learned Caldwell the way you learn a piece of music, by playing it daily until it lives in your hands. She made friends. The marshal's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Loretta Carr, who came to take tea sometimes and who had opinions about everything and appreciated that Ellen had matching opinions. The woman who ran the dry goods store, Agnes Plum, 60 years old and originally from Boston, who had come west with her husband 30 years ago and stayed when he died because, she said, there was nowhere else she wanted to be, and she had stopped letting other people decide that kind of thing for her. A young Comanche woman named Sunwater who worked at the trading post, and who, when Ellen made the genuine effort to speak with her without talking past her, turned out to know more about the grasslands and the weather patterns of this territory than anyone else Ellen had met, and who bore the particular weariness of a person managing daily injustice with a dignity that Ellen found both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. The injustice of how the native peoples of the territory were treated was not something Ellen could ignore, because she had not been built to ignore things that were in front of her. She saw the way Sunwater was spoken to in the trading post by men who would not look her in the eye. She saw the way the children from the agency school were moved off the main walkway when the cattle buyers came through. She could not fix it, and she was honest with herself about the limits of what any one person could do against the enormous machinery of government policy and territorial law. But she could be deliberate in her own behavior, and she could be loud when others were silent, because if there was one thing Ellen Hawkins had always been, it was loud. July came, and with July came the full heat of the Kansas summer, and the cattle drives reached their peak traffic, and the boarding house was full every night, and Ellen was busy every day, and she did not let herself count the days even as she was aware of them passing. Isaac rode back into Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of July, and Ellen was in the garden behind the boarding house cutting herbs when she heard his horse, and knew it by its particular gait the way you know a voice before you see its owner. And she straightened up and walked around the side of the building, and there he was. He looked better than when he had left. Or maybe she had simply forgotten what he looked like, and the reality of him was better than the memory. He was still dusty from the trail, and his hat was still well worn, and his horse was still the same good gray. But there was something easier about him, something that had loosened since the spring, since the negotiation, since the conversation on the porch steps about godlight and talking. He saw her and swung down from the saddle and did not say anything at all for a moment, just looked at her in the afternoon light. "You are still here," he said. "I am still here," she confirmed. "And your room is available." "Good," he said. He came inside and settled and came down to supper, and this time he chose the chair across from Ellen's usual seat with no ambiguity about it. And over the course of the meal he told her about the ranch, and about what had changed since the spring, and about how Porter's agreement had done exactly what they had hoped, giving him enough economic stability to challenge Calhoun's legal maneuvering properly. "Calhoun backed off the water agreement dispute," Isaac said. "When he saw I had solid buyers and a lawyer who knew what he was doing, the pressure points stopped being interesting to him. He moved on to someone else." "That is exactly what men like him do," Ellen said. "They go where the resistance is least. Your father teach you that." "My mother," she said. "She ran the boarding house. She could identify a bully at 20 paces, and she had very specific methods for making herself not worth the trouble." Isaac smiled. "I would have liked your mother." "She would have liked you," Ellen said. "She had very little patience for men who use too many words to say too little. She said the best kind of man says exactly what he means and not a syllable more." "Is that a favorable description of me?" "It might be." After supper they found themselves again on the front steps of the boarding house, because it had become a place that belonged to them without anyone having designated it so, and the July evening was thick with warm air and stars were beginning to appear in the deep blue overhead. "I thought about you," Isaac said, "while I was gone." Ellen held very still. "What did you think?" "That you changed something," he said. "In April, when I came here, I was like a man walking through fog. I had been walking through it for 3 years. I knew things were wrong with my business, and I was doing my best about it, but I was doing it slowly and alone. You saw through it faster than I did." "I just asked questions," she said. "You listened to the answers," he said. "That is harder than asking." He paused. "I also thought that I wanted to come back because of more than the cattle business." She looked at him. "I wanted to come back because of you," he said plainly, in the way he said things that he had thought carefully about, with no decoration and no hedging. "Because you are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time, and because when I am in a room with you it does not feel empty even when neither of us is talking." Ellen felt her breath slow and something in her chest open, very carefully, the way a door opens that has been shut for a long time and whose hinges need careful attention. "Isaac," she said. "I know it is soon," he said. "I know you have been through loss and I have been through loss and neither of us is in a hurry. But I wanted to say it because you are right that things should be said." "Things should be said," she agreed. "So I am saying that I am here because of you and I would like to stay a while if that is acceptable." She thought about being careful. She had been being careful since April and it had served her well. But careful was a tool, not a principle, and sometimes the most careful thing you could do was acknowledge what was already true. "It is very acceptable," she said. "I thought about you too, considerably, much more than I was strictly comfortable with." He looked at her with something that was definitely a smile now, full and quiet and warm. "How much is considerably?" "I wrote a letter to my friend Clara in Cincinnati," she said, "describing you as a guest who was particularly interesting." "Just interesting." She saw through it immediately, Ellen said. "She is clever." She wrote back demanding details. "What did you tell her?" "That you were quiet in a way that was not simple," she said. "That you listened, that you said exactly what you meant." She paused. "That I might be in some danger." He looked at her steadily. "From me?" "From feeling things," she said. "I am not very good at feeling things slowly. I feel them all at once and loudly, and my record of knowing what to do with that is imperfect." "I feel things slowly," he said. "Perhaps between us we arrive at the right speed." She laughed, and it came out unguarded and genuine, the way her laughter always did when something truly delighted her, and she watched him watch her laugh with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. He stayed for 2 weeks that July. During those 2 weeks something grew between them that had already been growing in the spring, but was now doing so openly, in the sun rather than under cover of practicality and boarding-house conversation. They took walks in the early morning before the heat settled in, down the quieter streets of Caldwell, and out toward the edge of town where the land opened up into the grassland, and you could see for miles in any direction. Isaac talked more than he had in the spring. Not excessively, not in the ways that felt like someone who was performing openness, but genuinely, in the careful, deliberate way of a man who is choosing to share something that has been private. He told her about Mary, his wife. Mary had been a gentle woman, he said, not fragile but gentle, with a talent for music and a patience for the particular loneliness of ranching life that Isaac had always been grateful for and never adequately expressed. She had died in the 2nd year of their marriage from typhoid fever, which had come through the hill country one summer and taken several people in the area, and she had been gone within 10 days of falling ill. "I did not say enough," he said one morning, standing at the edge of the grassland watching a hawk circle. "To her, I thought we had time. I thought there was no urgency because we were young and settled and the years were ahead of us. I kept things to myself the way I always had." He paused. "I would not make that mistake again." "No," Ellen said. "That is partly why I said what I said last week," he said, "on the porch. I did not want to wait until I had figured out something more eloquent. The truth was what it was." "The truth you said was exactly enough," she told him. He looked at her with that direct gray-brown gaze. "Is that true for you as well, that you would not make your mistakes again?" She thought about this honestly. She and Gerald had been married young, 19 for her, 22 for him, and they had been compatible in the surface ways, both from similar backgrounds, both decent, both committed to being kind. But she had talked and he had not quite listened, not deeply, and she had eventually understood that he loved her in the way one loves a familiar and pleasant thing, rather than the way one loves the particular irreplaceable specific person that a person actually is. "I would not marry for convenience again," she said, "or for settlement, or because I was told I should." "What would you marry for?" She held his gaze. "For knowing," she said, "for feeling known." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hawk. "That is a good answer," he said. He reached over and took her hand very simply, as if it were a natural thing, and they stood there watching the hawk and the grass and the enormous sky. And Ellen Hawkins felt more known in that moment than she had in years, perhaps than she had ever been in a certain essential way. He left again in early August, back to Texas for the final preparations before the fall, and this time the leaving was harder because they had named what was between them, at least in shape if not in full detail. He wrote to her from Texas, short letters in handwriting that was direct and unornamented like his speech, telling her about the ranch and about the summer, and about a particular evening when the fireflies were out across the creek pasture, and he had thought she would have had a good name for the light. She wrote back at length, multiple pages, and apologized in the first line for the length, and then wrote the rest anyway because she was still herself and there were many things to say. She told him about Caldwell in August, and about Dora's decision to repaint the boarding house front, and about Loretta Carr's ongoing campaign to have the town council address the state of the main road, and about a conversation she had had with Agnes Plum about Boston, and about the way the prairie changed in the late summer when the grasses went gold. She told him she missed his company. He wrote back, "I miss yours more than I know how to say," which is saying something given my limitations in that area. "The ranch is well. The cattle look good for the fall. I will be in Caldwell by October." She read that letter 4 times. He arrived in Caldwell in the first week of October, and the autumn had come to Kansas while he was gone, turning the grassland amber and bringing a sharpness to the air that made everything feel more vivid and deliberate. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, and Ellen was in the kitchen and heard his horse and was at the front door before he had tied up at the post. He came up the steps and she was standing in the doorway, and he stopped on the second step so that their eyes were level, and he looked at her for a moment and then said, quietly, "Hello, Ellen." "Hello, Isaac," she said. "I have been thinking," he said. About what I want," he said. "About what I am doing here. And I want to be clear about it so there is no uncertainty." She held herself steady. "I want to court you," he said, "formally, if you are willing. I want to visit regularly and write when I cannot visit, and I want us to see where this goes with both of us understanding what we are doing." Ellen Hawkins looked at this quiet, careful, honest man on the step below her, this man who had been too quiet for years and who was choosing now, deliberately, to speak, and she felt the full weight of the moment and did not try to manage it or deflect it. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He smiled, that full, real smile that changed everything. "Good," he said. "I also brought something." He reached into his coat and produced a small paper package, carefully wrapped, and she opened it to find 2 sticks of the particular cinnamon candy that had been. She had mentioned once in passing in a conversation about her childhood, her absolute favorite thing about winter markets. She stared at the candy and then at him. "You remembered that," she said. "You said it in April," he said. "I remember most things you say." She laughed, and her eyes went warm and bright, and she stepped back to let him in. And Dora, who was absolutely not standing around the corner of the hallway listening, made no sound at all as they passed. What followed was a courtship that was, like Isaac himself, unhurried and deliberate and considerable. He came to Caldwell every 4 to 6 weeks through the fall and into the winter, which, given the distance from Kerrville to Caldwell, was not a small commitment of time and travel, and between visits they wrote with a frequency that the postmaster noted with amiable interest. In November he arrived for a longer stay, a week and a half, and they spent that time in the company of each other and occasionally of Dora and Loretta and Agnes, who had collectively decided that Isaac Whitaker was acceptable and were proceeding to include him in things on that basis. He was bemused by this but not uncomfortable with it. He was, Ellen observed, a man who had a fundamental decency that made him easy for good people to trust even quickly. One evening in November she was telling him about her childhood, the real version rather than the edited one she had given in the early days, and she told him about the 3 miscarriages she and Gerald had suffered, and she watched to see how he would receive that, and he received it with exactly the gravity and gentleness it deserved, without flinching or redirecting. "We did not talk about it," she said. "Gerald and I each time. We just went quiet about it and went on. I think that was wrong." I think those losses deserve to be spoken about." "They did," Isaac said. "Do you and I have different ideas about children?" she asked directly because it was a thing that needed to be known. "I would like children," he said. "If that is possible and if you are willing. I thought about it when Mary died, that we would not have them, and that was its own grief." He looked at her steadily. "But I would not have children as a condition of anything. If you do not want them, or if it proves not possible, that does not change what I feel." "I want them," she said. "I am 26 and I am not certain of anything except that I want them." "Then we have the same idea," he said. December arrived, and with it a cold that turned Caldwell austere and quiet. The trail drives long since ended, the summer cowboys gone back south or dispersed to winter work, the town settling into its winter self, which was smaller and more deliberate than its summer self. Ellen liked winter Caldwell. She liked the way the cold made the air clear, and the way the fire in the boarding house sitting room drew people together in the evenings, made them talk more or sit companionably without the usual frontier busyness between them. Isaac came for Christmas. He brought from Texas a bolt of blue calico that was such an exact match for the color she had described seeing in the dry goods store in Cincinnati, the color she had thought about when grief ambushed her, that she stood holding it for a full 30 seconds before she trusted herself to speak. "How did you know?" she asked. "You told me," he said. "In October. You said blue calico was the color of the thing you wanted to start over." She put the fabric down and kissed him, which was the first time she had kissed him, and which was not planned but which was, she felt, entirely correct in that moment. He was surprised and then not surprised, and he kissed her back with the particular care of a man who does not do things lightly and who understood exactly what he was doing. Dora, this time, was genuinely in the other room, and they were genuinely alone. And when Ellen pulled back from the kiss, she could feel her own face doing something that she had no control over, a warmth and an opening. "I love you," she said, because the nearest true thing was always the right starting place, and this was the nearest true thing of all. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could hear the fire crackling and the wind at the window and her own heartbeat. "I love you," he said. "I have been working up to saying it for 6 months. Only 6 months. Well," he said, with that quiet smile, "possibly since the second week of April." She laughed and he laughed, and it was so ordinary and so extraordinary simultaneously that she wanted to hold onto that moment with both hands. He asked her to marry him on the 28th of December, 1882, in the garden behind the boarding house, where the winter had turned everything to silver and frost, and where they could see the smoke from the chimneys of Caldwell rising straight up into a cold, clear sky. He did not make a speech about it. He asked simply and directly in his exact way, saying that he wanted her to be his wife and to come to Texas if she was willing, and that he knew it was far from Caldwell and far from Dora and far from anything she had built here, and that it was a large thing to ask, and he was asking it anyway. She said yes before he finished the sentence. There was the matter of Dora. Ellen told her that evening, and Dora sat with it for a moment and then said, "Well, I knew something like this was coming since July." "Are you angry?" Ellen asked. "I am not angry," Dora said. "I am going to miss you considerably, which is not the same thing." She paused. "Also, you promised me a partnership." "I did," Ellen said, "and I feel terrible." "Do not feel terrible," Dora said. "Feel something more useful. I will hire someone else. It will not be you, which is the problem, but I will manage." She looked at Ellen with the formidable face that had the warmth underneath. "You have done something here. You have made this place what it should be. I want you to know I see that." Ellen embraced her, which was not something Dora generally invited, but she accepted it with something that was almost grace. There was also the matter of Ellen's letter to Clara, which was a very long letter and which made Clara, by Clara's own account, cry and then laugh, and then write back immediately saying she was planning to attend the wedding even from Cincinnati, and was already thinking about her traveling dress. The wedding was in March of 1883, which gave them time to plan and which allowed Clara to make the journey and which allowed Isaac's older brother, whose name was Caleb, to come up from Texas with his wife. Caleb Whitaker was a man in his mid-30s who had his brother's build and quiet manner and who, upon meeting Ellen, spent about 45 minutes in conversation with her, and then said to Isaac within her hearing, "She is remarkable. She talks more than anyone I have ever met, and every single word is worth hearing." Isaac said, "I know." Ellen pretended she had not heard this, which fooled no one. The wedding was held in Caldwell's small Protestant church, which smelled of pine and candle wax, and the ceremony was performed by the minister, a gentle man named Reverend Cole, who had been in Caldwell 3 years and who had, at Ellen's request, incorporated a specific promise into the vows that was not standard, which was that they promised to speak honestly to each other, to say the things that needed saying, and never to let the important words go unspoken, because of pride or habit or the mistaken belief that the other person already knew. When the minister pronounced them married and Isaac kissed her, Clara cried audibly from the second pew, which was entirely consistent with Clara's character, and which made several cowboys who had come to the church out of neighborly interest look profoundly uncertain about how to react. Loretta Carr organized the wedding supper at the hotel, because Loretta organized things and no one had ever successfully stopped her, and it was a remarkable supper with good food and good whiskey, the latter of which Ellen declined in favor of cider, and dancing afterward that involved the fiddle player from the saloon who turned out to be considerably skilled when not playing for a rowdy cattle crowd. Isaac danced, not elaborately, not with the showmanship of men who had learned dancing as a social accomplishment, but with the focused competence of someone who had grown up in a community where dancing was a necessary skill at the rare social occasions that punctuated frontier life. He danced with her, and he was careful with her, and he looked at her throughout in a way that she thought she could live comfortably inside of for the rest of her life. Clara pulled her aside near the end of the evening and said, "Tell me honestly, are you happy?" "Yes," Ellen said, profoundly. "He is quiet," Clara observed. "He is," Ellen said, "but when he speaks it is always the right thing. And he does not mind that you are you." Ellen thought about this. She thought about Isaac saying, "Everyone is wrong," in the direct factual way he said things he had decided were true. She thought about him saying she talked to him and made it easy. She thought about the letter that said he missed her more than he could say, which was saying something given his limitations in that area. "He does not mind," she said. "He thinks it is, and I am using his exact word, good." Clara smiled with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has seen her dearest friend arrive where she deserves to be. They left for Texas the following week, Isaac and Ellen Whitaker, on the southbound stage to Wichita, and then by train as far as the rail reached, and then by horse and wagon the rest of the way south through the hill country, which in March was greening up in the specific vivid way of Texas springs, the cedar and live oak and the grasses all contributing to a landscape that was altogether different from Kansas but no less extraordinary. Ellen talked the whole journey. Isaac listened. She asked questions about the land and he answered them, and she asked more questions, and he continued answering, and at some point, somewhere in the hill country with the cedars dark green on the limestone ridges, and the sky doing its own version of the godlight, he began talking alongside her, pointing things out, naming plants and water sources and the landmarks he had used his whole life to navigate this particular piece of the world. And she understood that this was him sharing his private interior world the way other people share it through conversation, through the specific vocabulary of a place he knew and loved. The ranch was real and solid, and more than she had expected, not large by comparison to operations like Calhoun's, but well-kept and purposeful in every detail. The house Isaac had built himself sitting at a good angle to the creek, the barn solid and the corrals true, the pastures in decent shape after the winter. There was a kitchen garden that had been neglected, and that made Ellen's hands itch immediately with the desire to work it. The 2 hired men, whose names were Roland and Everett, were respectful and quiet, and regarded Ellen with the particular wariness of men who had been living in a working man's household, and were now confronting the reality of a new woman's opinions about how certain things should be organized. Ellen handled this by being direct and fair, and by making it clear within the first week that she was not there to change what worked and was very interested in understanding what did. Within 2 weeks, Roland had told Isaac, apparently, that she was all right, which was, Isaac reported to her with his quiet smile, the highest endorsement Roland had offered any human being in his recollection. The life they built in the hill country of Texas was not easy by the standards of any life that was not on the frontier, but it was theirs in every particular, shaped by both of them in the specific way of a thing made by two people who have different strengths that are genuinely complementary. Isaac managed the cattle operation with the focused competence of a man who had been building it for years and who now had a solid buyer arrangement and no cowhound to contend with, the legal dispute over the deed having been resolved in Isaac's favor that spring through the persistent work of his San Antonio lawyer and the evidence of his legitimate purchase. Ellen managed the house and the hospitality of the place, and increasingly, the business records and correspondence that Isaac had always kept in a cursory way, and that she systematized with the natural organizational intelligence of a woman who had been running a boarding house. She also talked to everyone who came to the ranch, which in the cattle country of the Texas Hill Country in 1883 was a considerable variety of people, other ranchers and their families, buyers, neighbors, the occasional traveler, the Baptist minister from Caldwell who came through periodically, the teachers from the schoolhouse 6 miles east. She talked to all of them and they talked to her, and within a year she was connected to the social fabric of that community in a way that Isaac, in his years of solitary operation, had never been. He watched this with a kind of quiet wonder. "How do you do that?" he asked her one evening. They were sitting on the porch of their house, which faced the creek and the hills beyond it, and the evening was doing what evenings did in the hill country, going gold and warm and extravagant. "Do what?" "You talk to the Garrity family for one afternoon, and now Martha Garrity sends over preserves, and Tom Garrity offered to let us use his bull this season, and their oldest son has started coming to help Roland on the heavy days." "I listened to them," Ellen said. "Martha has been lonely out here since her sister moved back east. Tom is proud of that bull. It was worth asking about it. And their son is 17 and bored and needs work that makes him feel useful." "You heard all of that in one afternoon." "I asked the right questions," she said, "and I paid attention to the answers." Isaac was quiet for a moment. "This is what you have always been," he said. "This thing that people told you was too much, this is exactly what it is for." She looked at him. "You make people feel known," he said. "That is not too much, that is extraordinary." She felt those words settle into her and fill something that had been hollow for so long she had stopped noticing it. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. Say more things like that." He smiled. "I will do my best," he said. "It is a work in progress." Their son, James Whitaker, was born in January of 1884, in the house Isaac had built by the creek, with a midwife from Caldwell and, outside the door, Isaac walking back and forth with a patience and a visible terror that Roland later said was the most expressive he had ever seen the man be in 4 years of working beside him. James was healthy and loud, which Ellen said was clearly her contribution, and had his father's eyes, that gray-brown that changed with the light, and his mother's absolute conviction that the world was a fascinating place, deserving of full and thorough engagement. Isaac held his son on the first evening, standing at the window of the bedroom with the creek just visible in the moonlight beyond the glass, and Ellen watched him from the bed, tired to her bones and absolutely full of something that had no word for its size. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "That I was too quiet," he said, "for too many years, that I almost let that be the whole of my life." He looked down at the baby. "And that this is what comes from not being quiet." She laughed and then pressed her hand over her mouth because laughing still hurt. That is the most you have ever said consecutively. You have been a good influence, he said, and carried James back to her. The years that followed were full ones. The ranch grew steadily, not spectacularly but solidly, which was the kind of growth that lasts. Isaac built on the herd and on the facilities and eventually took on a third hired man when the work expanded beyond what two could manage well. Ellen ran the house and the records and a kitchen garden that became something a good deal more extensive than a garden, with fruit trees from a nursery in Austin, and a vegetable plot that supplied not only their household, but periodically, with some pleasure, the households of their neighbors. She wrote to Clara every month without fail, and Clara wrote back, and eventually, Clara herself came west for a visit in the summer of 1885, when James was a year and a half old, and Clara declared him a perfect child, and declared Isaac an excellent man, and declared the hill country of Texas the most beautiful place she had ever seen, none of which she had expected, because Clara had grown up in Cincinnati and had a city person's assumptions about wilderness. I expected to worry about you, Clara told Ellen on the last evening of her visit, sitting on the porch watching the fireflies and the darkness and the enormous stars of the Texas sky. And now I see that you are exactly where you belong, Clara said, which I should have known because you always land where you belong. You are just sometimes loud getting there. Ellen laughed. I have been told that, she said. By who? Isaac said from the other chair where he had been listening with his quiet attention. Everyone, Ellen said. Everyone is wrong, he said, and turned to look at the fireflies, and Ellen caught Clara's eye, and Clara pressed her lips together and looked enormously pleased with herself. Dora came to visit the following spring, which was a considerable journey for a woman who had not left Caldwell in 8 years, and she arrived travel-worn and formidable, and immediately declared that the boarding-house business was doing well under her new assistant, a young woman from Wichita named Adele who, Dora said, talked nearly as much as Ellen had but had not yet learned how to listen, and Dora was working on it. Dora spent 2 weeks at the ranch, and she and Isaac formed the kind of immediate mutual respect of two people who share a quality, which was the quality of meaning what they said without ceremony. And she and Ellen spent those 2 weeks in the kind of continuous conversation that had been the beginning of everything, sitting at kitchen tables and on porch steps and walking the creek path in the mornings. And Ellen was flooded with gratitude for Dora, for that first handshake at the stagecoach stop, for the boarding house and the partnership and the gentle correction that had not been a request to be less, but a request to be thoughtful, which was a different thing entirely. You look like yourself, Dora said on her last morning. I have always been myself, Ellen said. No, Dora said firmly. In Caldwell you were becoming yourself. This is what the finished version looks like. Ellen took that with her like the blue calico, like the cinnamon candy, like the word godlight, like everything she had been given in this life that she had not expected and could not have planned. Their second child was a daughter, born in the autumn of 1886, and they named her Clara, which made the original Clara in Cincinnati cry when she received the letter and write back an 8-page response that Isaac, who read all of Ellen's letters because she shared everything with him now, declared the longest letter he had ever seen. It is a competition, Ellen explained. You have been winning for years, he said. She does not concede easily, Ellen said. Neither do you, he said. No, she agreed, I do not. Baby Clara had her mother's voice and her father's stillness in interesting combination, able to command a room at 18 months with either a cry or a look, and she and James were close in the particular way of siblings, who are near enough in age to be companions, and different enough in temperament to be interesting to each other. The ranch by 1887 was stable and healthy, and the cowhound problem was a memory that had lost its shadow. Calhoun himself having expanded his operation north and been too busy with his own affairs to look south toward Isaac's modest creekside land. Isaac had expanded his acreage by 60 acres with the purchase of an adjacent parcel, bringing the total to 360, and the house had been added to with a second bedroom and a larger kitchen, and the porch that faced the creek was longer and had 2 rocking chairs, and sometimes a third when Roland came to sit in the evenings and talk about the next season's plans. Ellen by 1887 was not quiet. She had never been quiet, and she was not quiet now. She was known throughout that part of the hill country as a woman who knew everyone and remembered everything, and who had strong opinions about water rights and school funding, and the treatment of the Mexican families who worked the smaller ranches in the area, and who were subject to the same casual injustices that Sunwater had navigated in Caldwell: the looking past, the speaking over, the assumption of lesser standing. Ellen did not let these things pass without comment, and this made some of her neighbors uncomfortable and made others grateful, and made Isaac, when she came home from one such conversation with her cheeks flushed, and her voice still carrying the energy of something that needed saying, watch her with the expression she had first seen on the porch steps of the boarding house, when she had talked about the godlight sky, and he had told her his mother's word for it. "You are remarkable," he said one such evening. "I am exhausting," she said. "You are both," he said. "The same thing. Come here." She came and sat beside him on the porch, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the creek and the hills and the sky, which was doing its evening performance in its specific extravagant way, and she felt the weight of his arm and the warmth of him and the particular rightness of being in the exact place that she was, the place she had arrived at by being too much for some world and exactly enough for this one. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" He considered this in his deliberate way, not because he was uncertain, but because he was honest, and honesty for him required care. "More than I knew to want," he said. "Before you, I had stopped imagining things being different. I had gone into myself and pulled the door closed and called it being practical." He paused. "You opened it. By talking too much," she said. "By being exactly who you are," he said. "Which is a woman who talks and listens and sees clearly and says what she sees. Yes, by all of that." She rested her head against his shoulder, and they were quiet together for a moment. The kind of quiet that she had learned from him. The kind that was not empty but full. The kind that held everything they had built and everything they still intended to build. The words said, and the words being saved for later. The children asleep inside, and the night coming on, and the stars beginning to appear one by one in the great Texas sky. She thought about the stagecoach in 1882, and the driver who had begged her to step down so he could water his horses. She thought about Caldwell's dust and Dora's handshake and the gray horse, and the man who had said 10 words in 2 days, and turned out to have everything worth saying once he began. She thought about the long habit of silence, his and hers, his built from loss and solitude and the particular stoicism of frontier life, hers built from the accumulated weight of being told that her voice was too large for whatever room she was in. She thought about how 2 people can carry opposite wounds that heal each other if they are willing, if they are brave enough to try the talking and the listening in equal measure. "I have been thinking," she said. "I assumed," he said. "About the school," she said. "The one 6 miles east. They need a proper building. The current one is not adequate for winter, and the county will not fund it without a petition, and I think we could organize one if we started with the Garrittys and the Hendersons and worked outward from there." He was quiet for a moment. "How many people would you need to talk to?" he said. 20, perhaps 30, she said, "before we had anything worth presenting." "When would you start?" "I was thinking next week," she said. "Tuesday." He nodded slowly. "I will come with you to the Garrittys," he said. "Tom respects a thing more if 2 people say it." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You would come?" "I am your husband," he said. "I am not quiet about the things that matter." She thought she might love him most in precisely these moments, not the extraordinary ones but the ones like this, where he simply and without theater showed her who he was. "All right," she said. "Tuesday, Tom Garrity. Then from there." "From there," he agreed. The school was built the following year, 1888. A proper timber frame building on land donated by the Garrity family after the petition produced enough county support and enough community donations to make it real. Ellen was at every meeting and Isaac was at most of them, and the building went up in the particular communal spirit of frontier construction, neighbors arriving with tools and time and food, a day's work that fed itself on shared purpose. The day the last board went up and the windows were in, and the door hung true, Ellen stood in front of it in the late afternoon light and felt something finish in a good way, the way things finish when they have been carried to their conclusion by people who stayed with them. James, who was 5 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's certainty, stood beside her and said, "Mama, is that our school?" "It is the community school," she said. "But you will go to it, yes. Will you teach it?" She looked at Isaac, who was standing slightly behind them with Clara on his hip, his face turned toward her with its quiet, attentive warmth. "I might," she said. "I have some things I could say." "You have a lot of things you could say," James said, with the devastating accuracy of a 5-year-old who has been listening. The men nearby laughed. Isaac smiled. And Ellen Whitaker, who had been told her entire life that she talked too much for this world or that one, threw her head back and laughed at the Texas sky with everything she had, loud and full and unedited and entirely, gloriously herself. She did teach at that school, 2 days a week for several years, reading and arithmetic and history and composition, and she was, the children unanimously agreed, the best teacher they had ever had, largely because she listened to them with the same attention she gave to everyone, and because she never told any of them that what they had to say was too much. The ranch continued to grow. By 1890, they had added another 40 acres and a fourth hired hand, and the herd had grown enough to make the operation genuinely comfortable, not wealthy by the standards of men like Calhoun, but free from the anxiety that had driven Isaac to Caldwell in the spring of 1882, the quiet, desperate need to secure his own ground. Clara and James grew. James was his mother's son in temperament, open and curious and sociable, with his father's work ethic and his mother's love of conversation. Clara was something new, not fully one or the other but her own particular blend, quiet enough to observe and loud enough to declare, with an intelligence that both her parents watched with something close to awe. They added a third child, a son named Thomas, in 1891, who arrived in the summer and who had his father's stillness from birth, a baby who watched everything with a calm and evaluative gaze that made the midwife remark that he had the eyes of a man who had already seen a few things. Ellen wrote all of this to Clara in Cincinnati, every arrival and every milestone, and Clara wrote back faithfully, and eventually Clara moved, not to Texas, but to Wichita, Kansas, which was close enough that she came to visit every other year, and those visits were among the great pleasures of Ellen's life. She wrote to Dora too, less frequently but consistently, and Dora wrote back with the economy of words that characterized everything about her, short letters full of information, the boarding house doing well, Adele learning to listen, Caldwell growing as the frontier pushed further west, and the cattle town reinvented itself in the way frontier towns do when the era that created them moves on. One autumn evening in 1892, when James was 8 and Clara was 6 and Thomas was a year old, and the hill country had gone amber and rust in the particular Texas autumn that was shorter and softer than Kansas, but no less beautiful, Ellen and Isaac sat on the porch of their house as they had been sitting on various porches together for the better part of a decade, watching the evening come on and the light change on the water. "Do you ever think about Caldwell?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Do you?" "Often," she said. "I think about the stagecoach driver who wanted me to stop talking so he could water his horses. I think about Dora's handshake. I think about the porch steps of the boarding house and you saying you had been too quiet for years." "I had been," he said, "and now," he thought about it in his way, "now I have exactly the right amount to say," he said, "which is more than before and less than some, but enough." "Enough," she said. "Enough," he confirmed. She reached across the space between their chairs and he took her hand, the same simple gesture he had made that day at the edge of the grassland, watching the hawk, And they sat in the evening with the children's sounds from inside the house, and the creek sounds from below, and the first stars beginning to show in the darkening sky. Ellen Hawkins Whitaker, who had been told her whole life that she was too much, who had crossed half a continent and arrived in a dusty cattle town, talking from the moment the stagecoach stopped, who had met a quiet man and helped him find his words and been helped in turn to understand that her own words were not a flaw but a gift, looked up at the first bright star of the evening and said, because she always named things, because naming them was how she held them. Look at that. That is the first one tonight. Isaac looked up. He was quiet for a moment. It is the brightest one, he said. It always is, she said. The first one always comes in bright and then the others catch up. He squeezed her hand. I am glad you talked, he said. On that porch, in that dining room, on every stagecoach that would have you, I am glad you did not stop. I was constitutionally incapable of stopping, she said. I know, he said. That is exactly why. She laughed, and the sound of it carried out into the Texas evening, over the creek and the cedar and the limestone hills, open and generous and unafraid. The laugh of a woman who had found the world that was the right size for her voice, and the man who had been waiting, in his quiet way, to hear it. Inside the house, young James Whitaker told his sister Clara something that made her shriek with laughter, and Thomas, from his cradle, made the evaluative sound of a baby considering whether this development required his attention, and the lamp in the kitchen window made its warm rectangle of light in the gathering dark, and Isaac Whitaker sat beside his wife on the porch he had built beside the creek in the hill country of Texas and thought, with the particular fullness of a man who has lived carefully and been surprised by joy, that silence had its place and its value, but that the sound of Ellen's voice, across a breakfast table or a porch or a decade of evenings, was the thing that had made his life full in all the ways that mattered. He had been too quiet for years. She had more than made up for it, and neither of them would have changed a single word.